everyone, it's Phil here from 121 IELTS, and today we're going to be looking at a class that I took with my students where we were writing detailed paragraphs for an academic task 1 line graph. So this is the second video in a series of 2. The previous video we put out the other week so you could see how to write the paraphrase, the overview, and plan the essay. Have a look at the common mistakes. There are some vocabulary errors that my students make, which you very, very important that you don't make these because they're going to affect your task response. We're going to have a look at some really typical ways of joining sentences together. And hopefully after this, you'll have a much better idea of how to write a line graph for an academic task 1 essay. So the graph that we were looking at is this one. So it's referring to average carbon dioxide emissions per person in 4 different countries. It shows us that the measurement is in tons, and we've got a graph over time. So remember, when we're analyzing these graphs, and we're going to do this quickly, just to refresh everyone's minds, we need to be thinking about a couple of things. So first off, the type of chart. So obviously we mentioned already, this is a line chart or a line graph. What is the purpose of a chart like this? So is it to compare and contrast, look at data over time, or both? So a couple of people saying both. Maitreya said over time. So actually, Maitreya all on his own, who said over time is correct. This is very much a graph over time. This is not interested in comparing and contrasting. When we have line graphs, they usually tend to just be over time. The kind of graphs that you're going to get that are going to compare and contrast and be over time, like if you have multiple pie charts and those pie charts are also over time, or if the time isn't very long, so maybe you only have 2 or 3 years that something's comparing, then you're going to do a bit of comparing and contrasting. But certainly for a number of years over time, so we've got, my maths is terrible, 40 years, we have got a 40-year period over time. We only care about describing trends over time and talking about data over time. We do not need to compare and contrast this type of chart. How many categories are we dealing with? Yeah, we've got 4 countries. Verb tenses. So for verb tenses, we need to have a look at the data given. Everything is in the past. Everything we're talking about is going to be a completed action in the past. It's past and it's past simple. No other verb tenses are needed. Don't try and force all sorts of strange past tense. Verb tenses in, the only applicable verb tense here is going to be past simple. Do we need the passive voice? So do we care about objects? Nope. Unit of measurement, metric tons. And do we have a key? Yeah, we have a key here on the right, and the key is donating. The key is indicating about which countries we're looking at. So, yes. We mentioned last week that the key features here. So remember, because it is a graph over time, the only thing we care about is, does the data increase, decrease, is it stable, does it fluctuate? That doesn't mean does it fluctuate once, but is it consistently fluctuating? So to decide on key features, we look at the start point and the end point. We can see this, the trend is that France is decreasing. The trend is that Norway is decreasing. The trend is that Spain is increasing, and the trend is that Greece is increasing. So we've got 2 categories are increasing, 2 categories are decreasing. So how will we group our data? France and Norway, yeah, so we've got the 2 that are decreasing, and then Spain and Greece, because those are the 2 that are increasing. We've got 4 categories. These easily split into 2 details paragraphs. We've got 2 and 2. So increasing and decreasing. Which ones are going to go in the first details paragraph and what are going to go into the second details paragraph? Or does it not matter? Yeah, so Tamara says the first details paragraph should be looking at the decreasing data, so France and Norway, and the second one should be looking at Spain and Greece. This is because these are the first 2 on the key and these are the second 2 on the key. So again, it makes the most logical sense to talk about the decreasing data first and the increasing data second. Yeah, and we want to be as logical as possible. because this is what we are getting graded on in coherence and cohesion. This is what our structure will be. Remember, we always have 4 paragraphs. So it doesn't matter if it's a line graph, a bar graph, a map question. We always have 4 paragraphs for all academic task 1 essays. Unlike with task 2, there is no option. Cambridge will only consider 4 paragraphs as correct. Let's have a look at our decreasing data first. Again, are we going to talk about France first or Norway first, which makes more logical sense? So Mara says France, exactly. It's the first on the key. So if there's no other reason to talk about something else, we're going to go with the first on the key, the first thing that we can see, so France. Is this going to be easy to talk about? Gabby says yes, Tamara says yes, exactly. How many data points do I need to give this type of line? So data points, I mean, which years are you going to mention, Maitreya? So Tamara said we're going to mention 1975, 2005, and 2015. Marisol says 2. So Marisol, what would your 2 years be that we're going to mention? 1975 and 2015. Tamara has changed her mind to 2. Yeah, we only need 2 points. Because if we look at this data, it is consistently decreasing. You always need at least 2 points. You always want to mention in these types of graphs the start point and the end point. When you are referring to data in details paragraphs, I want you to get in the mindset that the examiner cannot see the graph. So imagine the examiner has a blank piece of paper and you are going to describe the graph to them. Now, if I said to the examiner that the emissions for France in 1975 were just under 12 metric tons, they decreased consistently until 2015 to around 8.5 metric tons. Do you think the examiner would be able to draw a line on their imaginary graph which would accurately represent the real graph? When students ask, what data should I include? What data should I not include? The data you should include is the data that is required for the examiner to draw their imaginary line accurately. So in this particular question, and you'll get these quite often, you'll get one line that just consistently decreases or consistently increases. We need to mention the first point and the last point. So who can write me a sentence describing France's data from the start point here to the end point here? Something that's really important if we look at line graphs, and line graphs, sometimes bar charts, but particularly line graphs. Do we know the exact data point? Do we know the exact number here? No. So if we don't know the exact number, what is something we have to do? Very, very important. Otherwise, your data is considered inaccurate. We have to use something. Yeah, approximations. We have to use approximations. So remember when you're writing your sentences for me, to include some form of approximation. And we want to be as close as possible. If you're watching this video at home, make sure you write along with our students and then compare your sentences with the sentences that my students make during this video. Okay, well, we're waiting for everyone else. Let's have a look at this first one. So my initial impression when I saw this, and I haven't read it at all, is that it looks too long. I might be wrong, and we're going to see if I'm right or wrong. But to me, at the moment, it's looking a little bit too long. So let's see if it is or not. So France displayed the highest numbers of the main carbon dioxide emissions. So rather than France displayed the numbers, so to display means like France went out and they showed everyone these numbers. So France didn't really display. What would be a better verb here? Tamara had, yes, much better. So especially with these superlatives, the verb have is very natural. France had the highest numbers of main carbon dioxide emissions. How can I make this a little bit more concise? Rather than saying they had the highest numbers, what did they really have the highest? And why main? Main doesn't make sense here. But looking at this, rather than saying they had the highest numbers, they had the highest emissions. So it's telling us what the emissions were. So the highest emissions, we don't want to talk about the numbers, we're just talking the emissions were the highest. So here, it'd be more natural to say France had the highest carbon dioxide emissions. Yep, there's more than one, so it should be plural. Emissions per person of all countries. Here, if we're going to say of all countries, we're talking about the specific countries we're referring to. So what should come before countries? The of all the countries. So we have a prepositional phrase here. Is it necessary, this prepositional phrase? So it's not incorrect, but if you want to be a bit more concise, so this is really going to depend how much data you've got. If we look at this graph, it's quite simple. So padding out your word count isn't a bad idea to just make these a little bit bigger. But let's say you had lots and lots to talk about and you wanted to be a bit more concise. This is also possible because France had the highest carbon dioxide emissions per person. We know that it's the highest. This is the purpose of using a superlative. The highest means it's the highest of the group we're looking at. So we don't actually need to use the word of all the countries. However, it is not incorrect. So here, because I think our essay is probably going to be a bit short, if we're too concise, we can include this. So here, maybe put over or throughout the period. Did it reduce gradually? So be careful of this word reduce. So reduce means you have a subject. Who is doing the reducing? We don't know. So reduce is a very, very dangerous word. It's not a synonym for the word decrease. So we're emissions. So it was the only country with emissions that decreased. So not gradually. So while they did decrease gradually, what's more important than gradual? It's not the only country that had emissions that decreased gradually, because if we look at Norway, from 1995 to 2015, this decreased gradually. Consistently, Gabby, yeah, that's the word we're looking for here. And then why have we got this object here? No need. Continuously, Maricel said, yeah, that's fine. It's the only country with emissions that decreased consistently during this expression I see quite a lot, word order. We don't say the all period. What is the order that it should be? Yeah, all the period. All the period, or simply, for me, this seems more concise. Okay, so consistently during the period. We started in 1975 at less than 12 tons. I'm so glad someone did this so I could point this out. We are never going to use this expression, less than or more than. Why? This is super important to never, ever use this expression in your academic task one. What is wrong with using less than or more than? It's too vague. The problem with saying less than, so less than 12 tons could be 11 tons. It could be 10 tons. It could be 5 tons. It could be 0 tons. It doesn't tell me anything. Less than 12 tons is too vague. Therefore, it would be considered as inaccurate data. So how could we be a little bit more specific than writing it less than 12 tons? So we started here, would be a much better expression here. So it's very close to 12 tons, but it's under 12 tons. So about nearly is fine. Again, if I say about, around, so it's good that we're using these approximations, but something we could use here is it started in 1975 at. Now I know this expression indicates an approximation. So it's not 12 tons, it's close to 12 tons, but we're under. So yeah, it's fine. I could also write around, about, roughly. So all of these are okay. To me, this is a little bit more precise, but all of them would be acceptable, just not less than, because less than is too vague. So we started in 1975 at just under 12 tons and finished decreasing in 2015 So if you finish something, the word you start and you finish goes with what preposition? Yeah, at. So if you're using the finished or started, this preposition is at. If you're just using the decrease, let's say, decrease, here we use to, because this verb is talking about movement. If you increase or if you decrease, it's showing an action, and to indicates the end of the action. So either one of these would be fine. You could say it finished decreasing in 2015 at around 9 metric tons is fine, or we could use and decreased until 2015 to 9 metric tons. So both of these options are fine. So this would be accurate. Like I said, I think it does have quite a lot of information here. But because we're not going to be writing a huge amount, I don't think that's a major problem. If you've got data that is fluctuating a bit more, we're just going to keep it simple with this. So if you've got lots and lots of data to talk about and you're trying to make your life a little bit easier, we can just have France started in 1975 at just under 12 tons and finished decreasing in 2015 around 9. So when we've got lots of data, this would be a good way of writing about France. But in this instance, we don't have lots of data to talk about, so this is also fine. Okay, let's have a look at our next sentence here. So average CO2 emissions per person. They emit more than one emission each, so we want the plural here. In France, started at around 12 metric tons, fine, in 1975, and then this figure had dropped to approximately 8 metric tons by 2015. Okay, this works here. Again, just because we don't have a huge amount to talk about in our details paragraphs, I would add here about it being the highest. So that's a nice part in the question. So where it says compare and contrast where relevant, I think this would be definitely relevant. We could maybe put in a relative clause to add information here and also make our grammar a little bit more complex. Average CO2 emissions per person in France, which were the highest of all the nations, started around. And this is a nice way of adding information, is using non-defining relative clauses. Apart from that, this is really nice. It was very accurate, so good job. So in 1975, remember, if you start a sentence with a prepositional phrase, you need a comma after it. In 1975, France had the highest number of CO2 emissions per person. Good. When we give these additional clauses, which start with gerunds, put a comma. So in 1975, France had the highest number of CO2 emissions per person, reaching around 11 metric tons. So reaching is indicating to me it's come from something to going somewhere else. I think here it would just be better. So if we knew the data beforehand, that reaching would be a bit more appropriate, but because we don't know any data before 1975, I would just use this preposition. So in 1975, France had the highest number of CO2 emissions per person, around 11 metric tons. This number decreased by about 2 metric tons 40 years later, so that means it should be 9. Is this accurate? Yep. What is my problem here? So this is correct, because we're talking about this number, so it's a singular number, but this is not a conjunction. So what do conjunctions do? Why do I want a conjunction? So a conjunction is a word that joins parts of a sentence. So here we've basically got an independent clause. Here we have an independent clause. So what type of conjunction joins two independent clauses? Gary says and, yeah. So what type of conjunction is that? You're correct. And is what should be used. So and is a coordinating conjunction. So when we want to join independent clauses, that is the purpose of a coordinating conjunction. So we need something here. We can't join sentences with the word this. Can I write this? Then this. So no, I cannot use the word then, because then is not a coordinated conjunction. And many students try to use then as a coordinated conjunction. So even if you use then, I still need my coordinated conjunction, because those are the rules of English. If you want to connect two independent clauses, you need to use a coordinated conjunction. Or you could use a semicolon. So now this would be grammatically correct, and our cohesion works a lot better, our cohesive devices. Okay, in 1975, good, we've got comma after the prepositional phrase, well done. The average CO2 emissions per person. Again, we're mentioning that they're plural in France. So this would be were around 12 metric tons. Be careful of spelling here. Ton actually has a British spelling and an American spelling. They're using the American spelling here, but if it's given to you in the question, we're using the spelling that's being given in the question. So the average CO2 emissions per person in France are around 12 metric tons. And then, so good, we've got a conjunction here. It, but we're talking about emissions. They was decreased, so this would look like a passive voice, but simply subject, verb, object. So this is an active voice, so we don't need the verb to be here in an active voice sentence. And then they decreased to around 8 metric tons at the end. We're talking about the specific end of the period. So we need the article here. And then we've got an independent clause here. Have an independent clause here. We put a comma for our coordinated conjunction. Okay, so let's quickly look. So we're starting around this point, so around 12 metric tons. Good. We finished to around 8. Sure, it's around 8. Again, this is specific. Something I could mention on both of these, we could say were just under 12 metric tons and they decreased to just over 8 metric tons. So this is another way of referring to this data. But definitely accurate, well done. We've looked at France. Now we're going to look at Norway. And Norway is the only thing that we have to do something what I call clumping. So clumping means separating your data into important points. So with France, all we needed to do was mention the first point and the last point. Now let's go back to our imaginary examiner. So our examiner is sitting there. He's got a piece of paper. He's trying to draw the graph from what we tell him about. How many data points do I need to tell him about? How many years are we needing to mention for him to have a pretty good idea of what Norway's graph looks like? Marisol says 3. Tamara says 3. Teresa says 3. Good. Yeah, 3. Exactly. So for our examiner to have a good idea of what we're talking about, we're always going to talk about the first point and the last point in these graphs over time. Because if you don't say where you begin and where you start, then the examiner could never have any idea of what you're doing. So we always got to have the start point and the end point, and we're going to mention 1985. And that's all we need to mention. So we're going to have a sentence or a clause talking about this, and then something talking about this. Do we need to mention about Norway being the only country that fluctuates? So no, it's just not necessary. So mentioning that Norway is the only country that fluctuates, not necessary. We've mentioned it has a fluctuation in the overview exactly. We don't need to repeat information that's been given in the overview. Do we need to mention it started as the second highest emissions and ended with the third highest? No. We're just going to report the data. All of that is unnecessary. Like the data was worth mentioning. It's the highest and the lowest is probably worth mentioning. Apart from that, we don't need anything extra. Otherwise, your essays are going to get super long. To keep it nice and simple, think about three points in time. Because you're talking about 2 time periods here, an expression that for you guys to help you to join these, this is a really nice way to join data. So after which, or, and this is going to be followed with. This is a nice way of joining data and talking about different points in the sequence. If you are watching this at home, make sure you write along with my students. Let's have a look at these two. Norway increased the emissions drastically. So the emissions belong to Norway. What would be a better way of saying it? So rather than Norway increased, so if this looks like Norway did this on purpose, so we've got subject, verb, object. So it's like, Norway said, okay, emissions are going to go up. So I don't think this is what they mean. Tamara said, yeah, we could talk about, and this would be a little bit more natural, Norway's emissions. So the emissions of Norway increased drastically. We're going to call this a drastic increase. I would be very careful with the word drastic and this is going on angles. If your angle is not more than 45 degrees, it should be up about here, I would avoid the word drastic. A 45-degree plus angle is quite drastic. Anything under that, I would say drastic is a little bit too strong. What could we use maybe instead of drastically, which is something which is not quite so strong? Significantly, considerably, yeah, I think these would work. From just over 8 tons. Excellent, so yeah, we're using this. We're not going to say over 8 tons because it's too vague. Just over is good. From just over 8 tons to approximately 10 tons. 10 years, so we would say not the first 10 years. So we need a preposition here, or in the first 10 years. Norway's emissions increased significantly from just over 8 tons to approximately 10 tons in the first 10 years. Good. After which, nice, the figures decreased consistently until, so we don't use until and to, because until and to basically have a very similar meaning. So you say until 2005. And then here, remember we have at with which words were we using at with? So at goes with start and finish. So have we got start and finish in this expression? So our main verb here is not start or finish, it's decrease. So this is where the to comes. So the to is indicating where the decreasing stops. So after which the figure decreased consistently until 2015. So this indicates where the time finished. The to indicates what the figures decreased to just under 6 tons. And now this is very, very accurate. So for the writer of this, you need to be focusing on your prepositions, making sure you're very clear about what the prepositions are referring to. Because if you make mistakes with prepositions, they can change the meaning of data. And if you change the meaning of your data, it's going to affect your task response as well as your grammar score. Apart from that, good sentence. Add that to the previous sentence, and we'd have a really nice paragraph here. The figure for Norway, this is one way of doing this. The figure for Norway began at just over 8 metric tons in 1975. Good. Here we've got began, so we're using at. Began at just over. Again, it's close to 8, but it's just over 75. If we use after which, we don't need the and. Okay, so we can use this after which as this cohesive structure. So after which, and no need for a comma. So this after which, you use comma, after which, plus a clause. Okay. So follow the structure. Independent clause, comma, after which, clause. After which, this number grew to around 10 metric tons in 1985, before decreasing to just under 6 metric tons in 2015. Beautifully written, really nice, good cohesion. Good job. Okay, so be careful here. When we've got two things in our sentence. We're talking about France, we're talking about Norway. So after we've talked about France, this is the end of our idea. What do we do at the end of our idea? Full stop, period, yeah. So the after which, or after that, is going to come when we're talking about the increase stops for Norway and then it decreases again. So when you're separating your categories, new sentences. So Norway's CO2 emissions, again, the emissions are per person, they have more than one of them. So we're approximately 8 metric tons in 1975, good. Which increased gradually to just about 10 metric tons in 1985. Good. So we just had a class, my trainer and I, about relative clauses. So it's really nice that you're using this to add information. Just remember, because this is a non-defining relative clause, remember you've got the comma before, which you're good at, but don't forget the comma after. And we know that this is all the relative clause because if we deleted it, this makes sense. So before decreasing to just under 6 metric tons at the end of the period. Good. Apart from that, well written. Hopefully I can see everything now. Okay. So Norway started the period with around 8 metric tons of CO2 emissions per person. Before, if we're going to use this before, what type of word here? We want the ing. So if you're going to use this before expression, you want the gerund. So Norway started the period with around 8 metric tons of CO2 emissions per person before jumping to 10 metric tons in 1985. And this was followed by a steady drop in the figures to just under 6 metric tons in 2015. Okay. This also works. This is accurate. I paused for a bit here with the jumping. I'm not sure if I would say I prefer increasing here to jumping. I don't really feel this is a jump. Again, a jump would be, I feel a bit more extreme. If you want to use a different word from increase, we could have rising. It would be more natural. Apart from that, good job. And so here we've written one very, very good details paragraph for this body paragraph if you combine these ideas with the idea that we had for France. Second body paragraph is going to be your homework, but I just want to have a look at clumping before we do this to make sure that you understand how we should clump, how many data points we should look at. So if we look at Spain, what does the data do for Spain? So definitely we've got increasing. Is it increasing all the time? No. So what's it also doing as well as increasing? Yeah, it's remaining stable. So if we're thinking about data points, well, from 1975 until 2005, we can probably just say it increased. We could maybe include 85. Again, this is kind of optional. Definitely, if you have a lot of information to talk about in the rest of your essay, I wouldn't include it. If there's not a lot of information, we could maybe include it. So I would say this point is optional, but from here it's important. Mentioning that we continue to increase, but then mentioning that the data became stable, it plateaued from 2005, 2015. So we've got chunk 1, chunk 2, and we've got basically 3 data points. This point, the start, 2005, 2015. These are key data points that need to be mentioned. Looking at Greece, again, imagining that you're trying to describe this graph to an examiner. How many points do we think we need to refer? Again, 3. I don't think this is necessary. Like drawing a line to here is almost the same as this. So I would say 1975, 2005. Again, it didn't remain stable, but it increased very gradually over this period. So again, I think this is worth mentioning. So we've got 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. So for both Spain and Greece, you've got 3 data points that we want to be talking about. And that is going to be your homework. Thank you to everyone who has watched this. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments or join our Facebook group.